Short attention spans are useful to control people, not for liberating oneself. You're going to need to expand your attention span. Speaking of which, LD, are you keeping an eye out for our guest?
I am. Excuse me. And there's somebody of that first name. And if that's you, would you raise your hand? Because I'm not sure.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I see. Wait a second.
There we go.
He identified himself.
It's all getting figured out right now on the fly as we do it live. This is exciting. All right. So
he's here.
Yeah, using TikTok going forward. I've never used, like, I don't have TikTok. I don't have Facebook, never had a Facebook account, these sort of things. But I see people around me getting sucked into those things. And when I ask them, like, hey, what are you getting out of that? Like, the questions could be answered with, oh, I'm going to be famous or something like that. So it's like, maybe we need to aim higher too. Maybe that's why we have journalism at an all-time low, because people accept it instead of aiming higher and saying, I want and deserve something better. Maybe that's it.
For themselves and for the world, you would think. But, that's why you have to get to the youth at a young age. It's that famous slogan, give me a child until he is 7, I will show you the man, something of that nature. Sometimes attributed to certain Jesuits, other times attributed to other individuals.
It's been passed around by useful dictators through the ages, whether it's Jesuits. Lenin's got a quote like that. There's a whole bunch of quotes to that effect. And controlling the minds of the youth is it just tells you a lot about your enemy, that they aim like at the least among us, the youngest among us, the least defended, and they seek to remove them from the house and indoctrinate them for long periods of time. But in order to undo that, you have to elongate your attention span. You have to point at things maybe available for consideration in your factual, actual historical picture of the world. I like to do such things and enrich my mind on a regular basis. And I had been keeping an eye on Reiner Fulmich's German lawyers doing this investigation and interviewing people for like the past year. And then they started doing the grand jury. And I woke up one morning and I had several emails to this effect. They said, you have to check out day 2 of the grand jury and you have to watch Alex Thompson's presentation, because he talks about GCHQ and Kroll Associates in South Africa. And that's what got me there. But I didn't stop after I heard Alex's presentation. I heard the next presenter and I was even more pleased with his presentation. His name's Matthew Ehret. I had no idea that he existed. And after watching that presentation, I was like, oh, we are all like going to be good friends in the future, because we have identified from multiple perspectives similar things, and we should trade notes and useful tools and resources. And do you know about this document? And, I'll look at that one. And I just sensed like a great growth opportunity in those just first 2 presentations for the truth movement. And I couldn't wait to see what else is going to be in that grand jury. And I'm still trying to catch up on that as well. There's a lot of good evidence being put on the record lately. And I think that we not only need it now to make better decisions, but the future deserves to inherit a better, cleaner, truer, more factual, less propagandized history than we all inherited. And that's part of like the reward of the struggle we're going through, is leaving it better for the next generation than we inherited it. Because we got it in the world of JFK and all those things that Richard Gage just said. JFK, Watergate, Iran-Contra, BCCI, Waco, Ruby Ridge, OKC, all the way up to 9/11, without anyone being held accountable. So I don't think we should let tyranny perpetuate into the future resisted. And I think that more intellectuals like Matthew need to be Johnny on the spot like this and get their word out. So I wanted to offer this platform and first meet you. Pleased to meet you, Matthew. How you doing?
Hey, pleased to meet you too, Richard. I'm doing very well. Thank you. And hi, Tony. Hi,
it's a pleasure to meet you as well. Incredible work. I've been all over your websites recently. A friend of mine showed it to me and I was the fact you cover so many different topics, and you also get into ancient history as well from so many different authors. It's incredible. I've been really diving into a lot of the articles.
I had like 30 tabs open from clicking. Oh, I'm interested in what because I didn't know. So I
have it up here. I have like
it's one of these problems, right? When you start realizing that everything is connected and everything is just sort of different aspects of the same ultimate story, then it kind of gets you into so many different parallel paths that seem very different at first until you start picking away at it and you realize the source is the same.
Yes. Got it.
So yeah, no, it's I'm glad that you guys are responding well or resonating well to it.
Yeah, and then I had this book set on my desk to remind me, because I just got this. This is William Dalrymple's the company quartet on the East India Company. And I'd watched a bunch of talks by him. And I was like, I got to get that book set. And at the same time, I went to Amazon and I put all your books in my Amazon cart too. But then I asked the question, does he offer them directly? Could I buy them in a way maybe they get signed and you keep more of the money because you don't have Amazon in the middle? So what's the story with your books so I can take this off my desk so I don't have to remember for the rest of the night?
Yeah. No, thanks for letting me plug my book. That's a great intro for that.
You have many books. Plug them all. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Well, I've got like you said, quite a few. I originally started off with a series of books that were the culmination of about a decade's worth of work on a Canadian history project, because I'm here in Montreal. That's where I'm based. And, I got into some political activism for quite some time, but it was a U.S. organization with a small Canadian outlet, without a strong sense of what the hell is Canada? Why are we a monarchy in the Americas? Why didn't we join the American Revolution? Like, what is the deep state in Canada? That was sort of a term that's obviously people have started utilizing more and more in the last few years. So to piece things together, we started a Canadian history project. And that started by just answering the question of why did Ben Franklin leave disappointed after 5 weeks of mobilizing here in Montreal in 1776. He was up here, trying to get the 14th colony to join and say, together with the other 13, we will declare independence and create this new type of government that had never been seen, that rejects hereditary institutions. So why did we fail to accept that challenge? So that was sort of the big question that kick-started the project. And then from there, that took us into other questions like, why did our rebellions, we had Republican rebellions in the 1830s, a couple in English-speaking and French-speaking Canada. Both of them were subverted by, I heard the reference to, or the allusion to Bertrand Russell, or at least the Jesuitical reference, and getting them when they're young. But Bertrand Russell's grandfather was in charge at the time at the British East India Company and the British Empire of suppressing the Canadian rebellion. So what was that story about? Then why did Abraham Lincoln's allies in Canada, who had found themselves in very high positions of power and influence in the Canadian government during the Civil War, why did they fail to achieve an independent Canada at the end of that Civil War? Why were they ousted? Why was a Confederacy, a British-run Northern Confederacy brought in instead of us becoming a republic when that was everything was moving in another direction? So what was that story about? And then up throughout the 20th century, what was the role of the Round Table, these British think tanks, the Fabian Society? How did they shape the policies not only of Canada, but of the entirety of North America throughout the 20th century? Using a lot of Carroll Quigley's work helped enormously. I know you guys have also talked a lot about Quigley. That helped piece a lot together. And from there, answering such questions like, what is British Canada? Why have we been used to run assassinations of people like Lincoln from Montreal, which is where John Wilkes Booth was deployed to kill Lincoln? And what about the case of JFK, whose Permindex, Mortimer, the figure who ran Permindex Corporation, which was identified by Jim Garrison, the district attorney of New Orleans, who ran the only jury trial over the death of JFK. He wrote in his final book, On the Trail of the Assassins, he sort of compiled all of his 30 years of research and put together the picture that had Permindex, a Montreal-based organization, which was formed during World War II as sort of an assassination bureau that grew out of this thing called Camp X. Yes. This is at the heart of a lot of assassinations, and this is what was at the heart of killing JFK. Again, Montreal. So what the hell is this thing called Canada? So we published these 4 books, or I published 3 of the 4. Those are available on my website. And then more recently this year, I published with my wife, Cynthia, The Clash of the Two Americas from 1774 until the present. And volume 3 should be out pretty soon. If people want to not buy them on Amazon, you can get the Two Americas from me directly by sending me an email to info@risingtidefoundation.net. I can throw a little signature in there if people want. Otherwise, unfortunately, Amazon just made it really convenient for me, and I feel a bit of disdain using them, but it's what I did.
No, I understand that. And I've got Permindex here. I didn't do a whole lot of research on it, but yeah, the idea of I think, I was going to mention Clay Shaw. Was that someone Garrison associated with Permindex?
Yeah. He's on the board. He was on the trademark board of directors, and he's definitely tied to Louis Mortimer Bloomfield on Permindex. Yeah.
Okay, so the angle on Permindex is interesting because you brought up Camp X, and I know about Camp X. Yeah. And I had just listened to a really good interview a couple weeks ago on Camp X before I went on maybe Grimerica or one of the podcasts I did. They had just done this whole thing, and I'm like, oh, I'll listen to that, because I was like, what are they playing recently on the podcast? And check it out. And I knew a good bit about Camp X, but this guy was really in detail about that farm. And that farm is what was used to create the CIA farm training center, right? And Camp X was an assassin training camp, but we also have a camp here in America that was an assassin training camp called Camp David. It's called Camp David now, but prior to it being repurposed as a presidential peace type retreat, it was used for that type of covert training, right? But Camp X opened December 6, 1941. The night before Pearl Harbor. It's ready to go and start training Americans to get into the war on the side of the British. And I had given this presentation a couple weeks ago that showed, like, I have the memoirs of John Cecil Masterman, who was in charge of MI6 at the time. He's like, we were running Agent Tricycle and Garbo and these other agents, and they knew about Pearl Harbor ahead of time, and they didn't want to tell the Americans because it spoiled the spawning relationship. They were just getting back together after this long departure. And if they knew they were if the Americans knew that the British were running those spies and knew about such things, it would have compromised their ability to keep spying on us like it kind of has been. So
the spies set up this situation real quick, whereby which we set up the embargo for the oil situation that caused Japan to be incentivized to bomb Pearl Harbor, with the sort of inability for them to gain the necessary oil they needed to fund their war effort. So like, it was actually all sort of, I remember that going back to Peace Revolution, like 84 or something like that. Yeah, they went into extreme detail about how in which they helped to sort of develop the policy that FDR put in place that then,
Well, FDR and his brain trust. Yeah. I mean, the way I see it is when America, so I was really inspired to hear your perspectives, Matthew, because you don't live in the United States. And I was always looking at it as an American looking at the empire, but you're a Canadian looking at the empire. And Alex Thompson, I believe that's his name. He's from UK, and he worked in GCHQ, which is like the predecessor and granddaddy of the NSA. So it was really interesting and inspiring. And I thought this Anglo-American connection, it touches Canada a whole lot. And I really hadn't done a whole lot of processing on that. And that's why I wanted to get your books and get up to speed and be like, what's he know that we don't know over here, and vice versa? What can we do? Where did you get into like the Rhodes Roundtable aspects? Did that show up in Canada too? Were there Rhodes Roundtable and Oxford scholars up there in Canada messing with you guys as well?
Certainly. Yeah. You can't understand anything about Canada unless you zero in on the exactly. No, the Rhodes scholarship, the Rhodes scholars, that whole hive of zombies who are indoctrinated and processed through the halls of Oxford. There's about 30 every year who are granted an indoctrination, fully paid for by the ill-begotten gains of Cecil Rhodes. And, for those who don't know or may not know listening right now, Cecil Rhodes was a race patriot, rabid, most likely pedophile, as well as everything else that he did, sitting in Rhodesia. That's where the area of South Africa, which today encompasses much of South Africa, Zimbabwe a bit more. That was called Rhodesia. He was the governor, and he ran things like De Beers came out of his empire. And he worked very closely with many leading race patriots. I mean, everybody who's higher up in the British echelons are considered race patriots, so-called, in the sense that they would like the world to be exterminated of all impure races and only allotted space for the Anglo-Saxon pure breeds, where maybe a few of the lower breeds are permitted to exist to do some of the manual labor. So there's a lot of pictures of him being like carried around by Black Africans. So he made a lot of money. He had Nathaniel Rothschild was a big investor as well, close collaborator with him. And he was recruited to become, to set up a secret society, as he writes it in his will, he wrote several wills, but his big one in 1877 served as sort of the guiding manifesto for how this Rhodes Trust was going to operate when he died, and how his funds would be utilized. So on the one hand, it was the Rhodes Scholarship system set up in order to, as he said, create a church of the British Empire, a form of secret society in order to recapture the United States. The British Empire, even generations after the revolution, never forgave the USA for creating a new precedent of rebelliousness in the world. I mean, this was the only one world government, after all. The sun never set for a very long time around just this one little island. You're wondering, how did this one little island control such a grand swath of global territory? And it's because they had a very intricate, multi-layered system tied to the City of London banking complex, which, just like today, even back then in the 18th century, was still the world's center of finance. It had an outpost that it had cultivated in all of its colonies. It had outposts, financial hubs, whether it was later on Hong Kong in the outskirts of China, or whether it was Wall Street that it had set up in largely 1799 with the Bank of Manhattan, founded by Aaron Burr, who used money he was supposed to spend when he was vice president on a water project, and instead he used it to found the Bank of Manhattan that became the basis of Wall Street. So you had this whole international tentacle system with a very developed intelligence agency, a capacity to profile different courts, kingdoms, and personalities that would be targeted for dismantling or self-destruction. If people want to get a sense of this, I always recommend read Shakespeare's Othello. For a really good clinical case study into the mind of this type of intelligence apparatus, and just look at the character of Iago and how Iago operates from Venice, because Iago, this is all taking place in Venice. And it's a little segue, but I'm going to get back to the roundtable. But Iago's character is somebody who everybody trusts as honest Iago. He's driven by something that is purely evil, and he just wants to destroy Othello, this great hero general, this Moor, who is, he's won multiple battles. He has the love of a beautiful damsel who just adores him, Desdemona. And he just plants little seeds of gossip, and he profiles everybody's weaknesses. Where's Othello's point of jealousy, insecurity? How does he inflame that against Othello's own best friend, who he gets to basically kill him and ultimately to kill his own wife? So he's just able to whisper in everyone's ear, and everyone just still trusts this bastard. Until all of these people, if they only would just talk to each other and realize how they were all being played and have that conversation, they would be able to break free of his spell. But nobody does that. They're all just so stuck in their own egos, and they play into his traps, and they all self-destruct. So Shakespeare is really just showcasing, he does this also in The Merchant of Venice and a few other plays too, just showcasing the nature and the structure of this oligarchical parasite, which if you want to know the British Empire, it really, you can't understand it if you don't see how the Venetians, which was the former center. Yeah.
Now we're getting into
it's a critique of Venice, and the Venetian oligarchy that existed around them, and also set up little Platonic and Aristotelian cults and these various things, because the new translations were starting to come over. This was around the time of the Gutenberg printing press. I mean, there's so many things that were happening. I remember when I went over to Venice, you look at the Senate room that existed in some of the old buildings there. It's really fascinating. Some of the architecture, some of the arts, and just the way they set it up is very, reminiscent of what we're kind of
absolutely
today. I mean, it's exactly almost like it looks like the exact same thing.
For 1,000 years after the fall of the Roman Empire, this became from like 600 AD all the way up until like 1688, I would say. This was a central point globally in maritime bullion control, maritime shipping, along with Genoa.
Yep. Genoa, the slave trade, because the Genoese controlled the slave trade big time back.
I got some slave trade over here.
Man, it was the
secret society, slave trades, oligarchy.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because it's really the model. It really is the model, and a lot of people don't realize that because a lot of times people approach me and say, "Well, you guys talk about the British Empire, but what about the Jesuits? What about the Vatican? Or what about this? What about that?" And I'm like, "Well, I mean, we could." It's really locating a philosophy or an ideology of control and power that has permeated and transmutated.
Venice or Lord Palmerston's Zoo?
Yeah, Palmerston's Zoo is the classic.
Those are both great pieces by Webster Tarpley before his brains melted.
Those were some of my favorite, the Black Nobility and the Venetian Conspiracy.
Fulbright scholar Webster Tarpley. I always use his full title. Full title.
Well, Fulbright as well, right? Senator Fulbright, another Rhodes Scholar, yeah.
Right,
American version, wink, wink. Yeah, I just want you brought up the tentacles too. We can't. I'd be remiss if we don't mention British Freemasonry.
Oh,
well, okay, Danny Clausen, sure, but British Freemasonry is a really important sort of element too. Jessica Harlan Jacobs' book, The British Empire and Freemasonry, is something to sort of reference.
Where it shows they set up
the cultural elements.
Posts,
yes, where
and then they set up forts, and then it was Freemasonic lodges, then trading posts, then forts, fortified trading posts, and then they made it a colony. And there was like this step of progression. Are you familiar with that book, Matthew?
I am not familiar with that particular book, though. I do find British Freemasonry fascinating. And especially the Rosicrucian pre-Freemasonic operations too are very, very useful to look into. And I'm preparing a presentation right now that I'm going to have to deliver in a couple of weeks, and I'm underprepared. But I've just been delving into the life and times, the geopolitical environment of Thomas More, like what was the world he was living in, and this has forced me to really confront a lot of these occult Freemasonic operations. Well, it was Rosicrucian secret society operations that were being run within the courts of England at the time, which is very interesting because it sort of leads you into what the hell did Henry VIII, the guy who had all of this potential, he was trained by Thomas More to be a continuation of his father Henry VII's policies to break the Venetian Empire. I mean, Henry VII was one of the key guys who was part of the organizing process that was going on in 1508, 1509. Erasmus was a part of that. So was Leonardo da Vinci, Machiavelli, to create the League of Cambrai. And most of the
Medicis were still in power at that point too. Mm-hmm. Medici Bank.
And Florence. And so Florence, France, were a couple of the core hotbed humanist centers that had understood the nature of this Venetian Iago game that was getting all of these different kingdoms to kill each other. You know, the Holy Roman Empire just constantly, it was it's like 2,000 prince electors and dukes, fighting each other over small bits of territory. But they were also fighting the Spanish Empire. They were fighting the English, the French. Everybody's just fighting each other. And finally, enough people with some brains got together and realized, okay, we're all being played. All of these wars being funded by the same Venetian bankers. And it seems like we're all following the guidance and dossiers, kind of like these Soros-funded international ICG, International Crisis Group type of profiles of each other's like operations. And they're all being provided to us, these different profiles, by the same Venetian ambassador systems. And like, wait a minute, why don't we just like stop killing each other? And maybe we can create a league and actually just deal with this parasite here that's trying to get us to annihilate each other. And the League of Cambrai is set up, which involves the Vatican. And I mean, everybody finally for 2 seconds works with a common cause to destroy the entire Venetian fleet. And just before they can go in with the second thrust to finally wipe this center of oligarchical command, these old bloodlines, right, that had managed the Roman Empire before that, some of them probably go back to Babylon.
Before Phoenicia, I would think, Phoenicia, I would imagine.
Maybe before that, elements of that. I mean,
it gets the
further back you go.
It does, yeah. I was going to say, but good.
But yeah, right before they could do that, all of a sudden, the Venetians, being really good rat bastards, are able to manage a bribe with the Pope, who pulls out of the League of Cambrai, declares war with the Holy Roman Empire, which has to go with the Pope with whatever he does. And all of a sudden, they have a new alliance that they create with Venice, and they also declare war on France and Florence. And all of it just disintegrates. But it's a wake-up call for Venice, who they basically realize they need to get into a more strategic center of command. They can't just stay in this area of the lagoons of Venice anymore. And they get their eyes set on partially Amsterdam, which is again a very creative zone. A lot of discoveries are happening. Revolutions in arts and manufacturing are occurring in Amsterdam at this time, but also in England. And they are like, those are the two areas that we have to take over, corrupt from within, like a virus takes over a host cell, and then use that as our new staging operation for reconstructing this new global Roman Empire, which was always the vision, is this restore the Roman Empire and keep it that way. Don't tolerate things like Christianity or other things like that this time around, and just keep like a paganistic scientific humanism of some sort, which is where the Enlightenment kind of grew out of a lot of these Rosicrucian sects. Exactly. Thomas More and Henry VIII's court is very interesting because it's a center of battle over whether it's going to be a driving force to revive Henry VII, who was a good king, his policies, or would it become this empire, right, that involved driving Henry VIII profiling him, seeing his sexual weaknesses, his arrogance, he had a godlike ego, and he had some advisors that were stationed right around him. One of them was Francesco Zorzi, who is Tarplay writes a lot about him in his work, and it's a fascinating character.
I just noticed a parallel with maritime powers like Phoenicia and Babylon and ancient Persia. The Achaemenid Empire had an unbelievable amount of control. In fact, Phoenicia came up with the whole idea of phonetics and our ability to communicate and do trade using being able to spell out sort of consonants and vowels. Yeah, the phonics. So
from Phoenicia to Phoenicians and Venetians, maritime trade.
Yeah, you got the
there does seem to be a history,
and then the British.
If you read Zarlinga's book, The Lost Science of Money,
with maritime powers,
you can follow it through. That's another angle on it. But I wanted to ask,
what's this book?
Buckminster Fuller talked about it.
The Lost Science of Money by Stephen Zarlinga.
Oh yeah, I have that over here.
And he published Quigley's Evolution of Civilizations book, because I corrected myself on that earlier today.
But there is also, let's not forget about the Venetian banker connection. They innovated this sort of double entry bookkeeping as well. So, and that's sort of based on the idea of credit debits, which is sort of like a callback to sort of a dualism in nature and the ability to sort of like rectify the dualism or find a balance between the two, which comes from sort of ancient mystery tradition. So there's a lot of you can play in so many different angles that it becomes.
Well, and to Matthew's point, it's like the White House is a mixture of Freemasonic, because that's a Grand Lodge over in Britain, but like the windows have like male and female symbols over the top, like moons and chevrons. And that's identical architecture to what's in Venice. So what they've taken is, you can trace lineage back to some of these things through the architecture that they're using to represent their current power. So I think there's a lot to it. And I wasn't planning to talk about Venice and Webster Tarpley, but this is good because we know about this, and we're still trying to learn and figure this whole evolutionary story of what we've inherited today out.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because a lot of the strange architecture, the eclectic architecture of Venice, it seems just so out of place, a lot of it. And it's only when you realize that a lot of this material actually came from their raping of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusades, which Venice bankrolled, and people think, the Crusades were all about Christians going to try to win back the Holy Land from the Muslims. And it's like, no, wait a minute. Constantinople was a Christian domain. It was the center of the Orthodox Church. So what the hell did these Christian mercenaries do? They didn't even make it to the Holy Land. They just went and looted, destroyed Constantinople, stole all of the relics and artifacts, brought them to Venice, and just forgot to go to the Holy Land. That's a whole story there, but
the translations by Ficino of Plato and Aristotle, and you have also the Emo tablet or the Corpus Hermeticum. The Corpus Hermeticum, which also gets translated. I think that was the first thing that they want to translate it first, and that all gets sort of pushed out into the European culture. Not to mention that the Crusades, the first or second sacking, I forget. In the 1204, there's the sacking of Constantinople, and then you get the influx of Aristotelian principles and Platonic principles to Albert the Great, Albertus Magnus, who then is St. Thomas Aquinas' teacher, that sort of begins the secularization process of Europe itself, because he separates natural theology from revealed theology. Now you can study philosophy again, which gives, only a century or two later, we start to get the burgeoning of beginnings of modern science and the Renaissance. So you see how it all sort of connects, but you're right. It wasn't just, them going to sack because it was a rape and pillage operation. It wasn't under the guise of this sort of movement for holy divinity or something of that nature in regards to this false idea between Christians and Muslims and then the war set up. Yeah, that was to galvanize the people in order to do it, but that wasn't the real purpose.
Yeah, and Venice too, which was the earliest to print. A lot of the Hermetic works and also just Gnostic works, Kabbalistic works were published and utilized by the inner sanctum of Venice. And here's, I think, the interesting thing that I'm pretty sure Tarpley gets this point across. Otherwise, I forget where I learned it. But that when they were trying to figure out how do we take over or get into a safer, more strategic zone of operation, where they had their eyes set towards the British Isles, you had a big fight, whether between these factions, the older school factions that wanted to just keep doing things as they had been doing them for hundreds of years, which is just suppress the power of creative mentation in your target audience. Just suppress truth, suppress scientific discoveries, and call scientists heretics, burn them if need be, just crush it. And then the other grouping realized that that's a little bit overly messy, and the genie kind of already blew out of the bottle, and you can't really, it's not so easy just to put that away or force it back into the bottle. This is like during the time after in the wake of the Renaissance, where it became through the teaching of orphans, like kids who weren't born of noble blood, kids who, didn't even know who their parents were being trained by the Brotherhood of the Common Life through the various monasteries to learn ancient Greek, learn Latin, translate. And as they did that, they cultivated within themselves their deeper powers of their own natural genius. And they became the intelligentsia that was working in opposition to this Dark Age faction that wanted to just bring back this feudal, system of master-slave society. And people like Leonardo da Vinci came out of this process and was making pioneering breakthroughs in every single field he put his mind to, whether it was astronomy or engineering or the arts, painting, music, architecture. Breakthroughs were being made because he had access to his full self-conscious creativity. And it was not just him. He was a good, a paragon of it. But this was like blossoming, and institutions were being created to carry it forward to more generations. This was like a mortal threat to the empire. And so while one group was like, no, we just got to smash, the other grouping, which was the Giovanni faction around this figure named Paolo Sarpi, realized, well, no, I think we need to take a more subtle, nuanced approach here, guys. And basically they were like, well, if we can't destroy the discoveries directly. What we can do is say we love the discoveries. We could say we encourage them. We're actually the team of discoveries. That's us. And then we'll repackage them and tell and control the narrative of how discoveries happen. And we'll call it empiricism. We'll say the way discoveries happen is you use your senses. Maybe you get lucky and an apple falls on your head, and then a formula that describes how the rate of fall of the apple can be created that people can memorize and repeat to get an effect. But the actual cause of the human discovery that went into it, we'll just extract that, so nobody ever gets to learn how that works. And they're just repeating formulas thinking that they get knowledge. And that really did a lot of damage. But that's what became the dominant force and this also explains why a lot of the leading Enlightenment thinkers like Descartes were also rabid mystical freaks. Like they were all into Gnostic, Rosicrucian mysticism, because they themselves weren't great discoverers. They were just synthetic cardboard cutouts who were created because somebody has to have made the discovery, right? We've already killed or at least obscured the people who were the Da Vinci's, the Keplers, the Huygens, the Fermats, all the great discoverers. We've obscured them enough. We've stolen their discoveries. We've given it. We have to package it now and create it, reappropriate it, and associate it with some dyslexic, amoral freak. Whether it's an Isaac Newton who was into black magic, alchemy, witchcraft. And that's not me. I'm not slandering.
There's
Isaac
arguments that he was a pedophile and stuff. Like there is some strange, possibly. Like it's when you look at and then there's the war between him and Leibniz, which is sort of artificially created and set up. I mean,
war of calculus.
War. Oh, just like where it came from. But to your point, Matthew, I mean, just the idea of all these most of the great thinkers were into very secret societies, Gnostic ideas, Rosicrucian ideas, Hermetic ideas, Platonic ideas, Aristotle. I mean, it's just, and Aristotle, interestingly enough, was sort of a champion of induction, and the inductive method is what that sort of generates that creative capacity. It's they go about thinking about the world and experiencing the world and coming to some. But instead, they imposed a sort of deductive hegemony on it, which has said, no, we come up with the solutions now. Here's how we're going to dictate the truths that are coming into the Renaissance that have already started to permeate from the 12th century onward, or 11th century, or excuse me, the 13th century onward. It made me think of an analogy real quick of Beatrice Webb, like the Aurora and the Fabian strategist, like the great Fabian strategist, Beatrice Webb. I'm forgetting the other one. Whereas one wanted to kill him with kindness, one wanted to just kill them. And so it's like, how do we mix the two together? And I just thought of that analogy when you're talking about what was going on with the Venetian hierarchy in regards to how to manage it.
Yeah, right. Sarpi's secret society, I think it was called the Venetian Dead Souls faction, and that source of that would be.
He didn't call it that. I think that's what.
Right. I was going to say that's Tarpley's Gollum of Venice presentation that I put that in there from.
Oh yeah. Well, that's appropriate. That was an appropriate name. Harpley gave it. I think one thing was that's super interesting, and I had the opportunity to read a lot of these original texts. I mentioned at the beginning that I was in the Canadian branch of a US-based organization. It was with the LaRouche organization back in the day, and LaRouche recently died, I think at the age of 96 in 2019. And so was the Canadian. But in the course of that, I was in that organization for about a decade. And one of the good things that I really appreciated was this focus on reading original source material. So for a couple of years, myself and a few of my Canadian younger friends were working through Kepler's works. And one thing that strikes me was that Kepler, in the course of writing his Harmonici Mundi, the harmonies of the world, where he discovers his third law of planetary motion, which is then later repackaged in the form of Newton's inverse square law. But this book, he works through the harmonic orbiting, the reason for why the orbits of the planets are where they are, based upon a harmonic theory that had been first developed or publicly in Plato's Timaeus dialogue 2,000 years earlier.
Right.
And he actually takes
geometric proportions.
Yeah. And using like the Pythagorean monochord, using certain strings and frequencies, you're able to then get certain relationships.
Yes.
And utilizing the slowest and fastest moments on every orbit, you're able to then get certain ratios that are in harmony with these, basically the major and minor scale. That's and from that, his third law, which is, I think, in short form, the cube of the mean distance of every planet to the sun has a certain relationship to this square of the periodic time of like one single orbit. So it's a square cube relationship.
It's a square
3D relationship.
Yeah, 2D. That's right.
And at the end of that, he has a whole attack on Robert Flood. And so Robert Flood is the founder of, he's one of the founder of Rosicrucianism, as it is known.
Because it's the Christian Rosenkreutz, for those, I think that's not a real person, by the way. That did not exist. So people would think that Rosicrucianism was started by, no, that's like a symbolic figure. It was Robert Flood and a couple other individuals. It's escaping me because I haven't studied Rosicrucianism in a bit, but I do remember that
John Dee plays a role in that.
John Dee, who's an interesting and dubious figure in history as well when it comes to Matt. Like that dude's sketchy as all hell. But I mean, to your point, I mean, this is stuff that was
when you actually read by reading Kepler, I was so shocked. I'd heard of Robert Flood because I'm a conspiracy theorist. That's just
sure.
The name you see when you're looking at this stuff, right? Yeah. But then here's Kepler actually destroying Robert Flood. He's like openly who lives in his lifetime, right? And Robert Flood, remember Francesco Zorzi, the guy who's Zorzi, brainwashing Henry VIII and inducing him to go and create a schism in the church and create his own church and just to get a divorce and get laid. Yeah. Francesco Zorzi, he's the one who is the godfather, the inspiration for Robert Flood. He writes a book in 1540 called Harmonies of the World. And it's like this really esoteric Gnostic version of witchcraft, basically. Yes. And so this is where partially Kepler is running a very high level cultural warfare operation against this whole parasite by calling his book The Harmonies of the World, but doing it right, actually demonstrating and showing you how his mind is working every step of the way. And Correct. If you go through it, you realize he's not just using only deductive and only inductive reasoning. He's using a little bit of that, a little bit of the other, but he's doing something more. So it's not just a combination of the deductive and inductive or a priori, a posteriori methods of thinking,
Sure.
I feel like I'm talking above maybe people who might be listening, but just to be quick, all I need to say,
don't judge our audience like that.
No, I mean, it just happens sometimes where people are like,
it's the first time they've heard about Kepler
for the audience
in this podcast, but it's not beyond their grasp. Please give them.
But the deductive, the a priori, a posteriori thing. That's so basically
analytic, synthetic.
Basically you start with sense perception,
general to specific, and specific to general, and it's a convection current. That you use to internalize the things that exist, and like law is the adjudication of the specific to the general. Right, because the specific incidents happened, and then in the general they compare it to what the law is, and then the adjudication goes on to the judge, and that's kind of what your brain does.
Yeah, like you have like common law and civic law. Like, so civic law, the French law would have more of like an a priori approach, where it's like you start with the general rule
principles, and then you deduce from there.
And then you use those to guide how you judge the particulars. Whereas the common law, like you just mentioned, would be like, yeah, you got these particular case studies, and then you
generalize to a rule from, or a general principle from this particular case studies.
For the audience at home who might be lost, we start with, in the latter, the common law, you start with that which exists, and then you go to how does that relate to general concept. And the a priority, which is like the Descartesian French thinking, you start with the idea of the rule and you see how does it compare to reality. But it's really a convection current, and both ways can work as long as you understand freedom and slavery.
Yeah. But to your point, Matthew, there's something more to that. Yeah, there's something more there. And there's retroduction. We could talk about sort of the apophatic. There's also the idea of an analogy and relationship in the context of Plato, standing into like a more transcendental principle, if you will, but that's done through apophatic or through retroduction or through negation, which is a whole
negation. Yes. Yeah, and also the question of metaphor, like the poetic quality. Like if I say I've got butterflies in my stomach, that it sounds absurd.
Right? How do you get them in there?
Huh?
It's like
how do I get them there? Exactly.
The vaudeville acts where they cough up like 9 frogs, or like David Blaine did that on Rogan too more recently. But butterflies, frogs in the stomach.
But it has no literal or linear connection whatsoever to the actual meaning that everybody understands when I said that. If you're nervous, that's what you say. But then there's no literal connection that's either deductive or inductive. It comes from a different place. Right. And so having that additional creative flexibility to leap outside of the known structures of what already, because I mean, if you want to make a new discovery, nothing that is known will help you make that new eureka. That requires a leap into something else.
An unknown.
Right.
It's an unknown. And that's an interesting thing about many of the great discoveries in history, is that oftentimes not only when you read the great mystics in history, sometimes it's like a mystic inspiration or divine madness. Like if you think about it from, the Phaedrus of Plato, like there's some sort of like inspiration that takes place that transcends just simple discursive reasoning that we think is the what manifests these sorts of ideas. But that's a fantastic point. There's something more to it. And to think about, I mean, Rich turned this into a Peace Revolution podcast, but this man, his name David Harriman. He was I think an objectivist philosopher, if I remember correctly, but he's a scientist and was a physicist. And he talks about this issue, the great discoveries in history. It's a little bit watered down or whitewashed, you could say, but he did make a good point. Oh, you have the book, A Logical Leap, and he champions the inductive method. But the bigger point is just the fact that in history, these great discoveries weren't top down. It's inspiration. There was induction involved. There was just like there's the recognition, as you pointed out, to these almost transcendental principles that I think Tycho Brahe was also a part of that, but also to Matthew's Kepler point, as well.
Copernicus, Kepler, Tycho Brahe. And there's a logical flow of one leaping off the shoulders of the next one into the unknown.
But they show you the process.
Right.
Like that's what David Harriman points out. They show you that, like, how did they think? You get to see how they think, how they thought. And like, that's what's arrested or anesthetized in modern schooling for children, is like, you're given, you learn algebra, which first of all, algebra is separated from geometry. You separate form from abstraction. So you can't relate abstraction to form. But then there's just the issue of like, you're given the to your point, Matthew, like this is, the formula for gravity, here's the fall rate, 9.8 meters per square, like we discovered it for you. You don't need to think anymore. Like you're good. And that's to get control of that, the Sarpi sort of method, very, very deviant, very clever.
Absolutely. So, yeah, no. And it treats you like a computer, right? Like that's what you do with a computer. What goes in is what comes out. So you program the computer with certain inputs, and it is limited to that. So how can people fall into this cult of artificial intelligence that's so big nowadays, right? That's at the heart of this whole fourth industrial revolution. A big part of that is the belief that the linear increase of complexity in computing systems, which is obviously able to calculate faster than the human brain, is going to make human beings irrelevant. And thus either we have to merge with them or accept this Skynet type of matrix future, right? So the only way you could get people to like actually chew and swallow that crap is if you can get their minds to be treated like computers, so that they don't actually know what human thinking is, because all they've been given is memorize repeat, like a computer. And so they can't refute somebody saying, oh, but a computer can do this faster, and thus you're going to be irrelevant. And you're like, oh, I guess I will. Yeah, shit.
Who put the inputs into that computer though? What programmed the if then statements? Because there was a question. I teach logic. I'm teaching logic to this community now, and someone had posed this question to me, just going over like real simple basics of Aristotelian theory, and in the light also some of the ideas of Plato as well, but mainly Aristotle. Just to start, I want to give them the basis before I get into the good stuff with Plato. But when it gets to Aristotle, they're asking me a fallacy. It's like, you ever hear this fallacy called the machine fallacy? I'm like, what the hell is that? It's more of a metaphysical fallacy. But the idea is that, oh, well, we're just machines, and that eventually computing power will overtake, in the that Douglas Hofstadter sort of argument about recursion, like we'll reach to a point whereby which machines will become intelligent. And I'm like, that's the sort of fallacy of misplaced concreteness, where they're taking something that's purely abstract and immaterial that the human mind does and the volition associated with that to make choice, and assuming that's going to be something that's going to be able to manifest out of a machine. That we've not been able to do that because everything is a closed system feedback with machines. So we can program the most complex ability for them to take disparate pieces of information that we have to input, and then they can pump out all these probabilistic models that seem like that they're thinking, but it's like an artificial simulacrum of the process by which developed that. It's almost like this sort of idea of emanation and standing in relation. That which emanated is always going to be lesser, but it's like we're doing the same thing here. We're creating something or manifesting something that's like us, but it's going to be like a lesser form of that, something that's not going to have sort of endowed with the same sort of ability or capability, that conceptual reasoning, which is a truly immaterial sort of, I say spiritual in the sense that there's no physical, it's like a field of a magnet in a way. Maybe they come up with like virtual photons in order to describe a field of a magnet, but it's like, no, it organizes matter, it affects matter, but it's a field effect. It's something that's immaterial. And there's something that truly transcends just the simple understanding of how that looks. So there is right now this push to push us into this sort of technocratic, transhumanistic model. They want it more than anything, but the irony is they have to lessen that which makes us most human, that conceptual capacity. Descartes, sort of the idea of the soul or the seat of the soul, that sort of idea.
I mean, I exist, therefore I think to continue existing. So, but I understand what he was saying too. Yeah, I can understand both sides.
He made errors, but he got his point though. I get where he's coming from. Let
me ask this real quick, because I know your time is precious, Matthew. Have you ever read this book?
Save me straight. The Fire in the Minds of Men: Origins of the Revolutionary Faith. No, I haven't.
Oh, my friend, this book.
I'm writing down so many titles in the short time I've been here. All right, I'm writing.
I wanted to offer massive value. This is written by James H. Billington, who is a Rhodes Scholar and Librarian of Congress for the United States of America. This is the gent right here. Very smart guy. In here, you're going to find like the official history from the Library of Congress on like the Rosicrucians, the Illuminati, right? This is like, it's an amazing book. I found this after I found Quigley's Tragedy and Hope, because I was like, who else knows about this stuff? And there's a particular passage here on page 231. I point to it often because in one paragraph, you can learn a lot. In 1843, B.F. Trenchowski invented the word cybernetics to describe a new form of rational social technology, which he believed would transform the human condition. In his neglected work, The Relationship of Philosophy to Cybernetics, or The Art of Ruling Nations, he also invented the word intelligentsia. So like a half hour ago, when you said intelligentsia, I was like, oh, I know where that word originated and where the book is and what page it's on. And I wanted to make sure that I got it on your radar. Because
that's a golden lead. I didn't.
It's a fantastic work.
I thought cybernetics was developed like 100 years later by Norbert Wiener.
I got all Wiener's book too, and I know all those cats. But this
dated
book,
it by 100 years earlier. That's amazing.
There's a lot of that.
And
going
I think it takes like
etymologically
from the idea of a helmsman. So it's like being able to control the steering a ship or something of that nature. The sort of Kybernetes idea.
Kybernetes, exactly. That not everybody on the ship needs to know what the ship is doing. Only the helmsman needs to understand what the hull is doing, and everybody else can just be hyper specialized in their local whatever mini job they have. And that's exactly how the post World War II age worked. I'd be curious to know what this Trenchowski's relationship to the Fabian Society is, if any. I'm sure there is.
If you want to, well, he was before the Fabian Society got rolling. I'll show him to you in the history.
Yeah, 1843 is what you said.
Trenchowski. I have him in here. His name is Bronislav. if because the BF part. And he's discussed. We discussed him in the Ultimate History Lesson with John Taylor Gatto, Hour 3. He's one of the people. And if I have a second entry, influenced by Hegel, he was a Freemason. Believed in the divine right of kings, part of mystery schools, and a father of cybernetics. He's around the same time as this guy Moses Hess, who wrote a very interesting book in 1861 that basically said, let's get Freemasonry and some financing and use secret society to infiltrate Freemasonry, much like an Illuminati type plan. But this was like around the time of the American Civil War. And it's called Rome and Jerusalem, the Last Nationalist Question. And we're going to cut out this interview in a couple of days. Like the post-production crew will cut this interview out and put it out there. So don't feel like you have to take all the notes real time. There'll be a replay. But I was just so excited on these various topics. So how old were you when you read this book? Have you ever read this book? And how old were you?
I'm rereading it currently, the 1986 edition, as we speak, because I wanted to get a better sense of the Bronfman, Hoffman, there you go.
I have the 1992 version, and that's like my original marked up version. Yeah. And then I also got this one because I like this subtitle better than this subtitle. It works better to understand for people what's going on.
That's the 2010 edition, I think.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. It's less meaty, I find, but that title is better.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things in this big book, I call it, that are just fascinating and
it's solid.
Can be verified by other sources. And then,
the forces of the oligarchy tried suing the staff of EIR like 10 times, and they couldn't get anything across. Like everything passed the mustard every single step of the way, so they couldn't get this thing taken off the shelves. So
they had to have Lyndon LaRouche Theater and Saturday Night Live take them down.
Yeah, exactly.
Have you had an opportunity to read this book?
I own that book, and I have not read that book, though.
All right. Do yourself a favor. At least read the foreword. That's what I'm saying. It's just 30 pages. And then if you're interested in reading the rest of the book and understand, but it's William Yandell House, Rhodes Scholar that trains a bunch of American Rhodes Scholars, has a big influence on America. I don't know how it translates into Canadian history, but I'm interested in finding out.
I'll tell you.
Yeah. What do you got?
He was also the teacher of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who was sent down to become one of Yandell Elliott's boys, special little boys in 1947 or so, before Yandell Elliott sort of talent searched him and then deployed him with letters of recommendation to Harold Lasky in the London School of Economics.
Just for fairness, I wanted to show I do have that connection. I just forgot. There's Yandell Elliott, because at one point I mapped out the students, but you're Johnny on the spot with that. That's good. That's good. You understand Maurice Strong and Pierre Trudeau and those guys. Yeah.
Well, what's interesting about Maurice Strong, in Ellen Dewar wrote. Did you guys ever read Cloak of Green?
I don't think so.
I don't think we're
I got to take notes.
Hard to get now.
No, we got to take note. Yeah.
Jeez.
Yeah, Cloak of Green. That was one of the most useful books. She was able to get exclusive interviews with Maurice Strong, and over the course of several weeks, and it is raw. She went in there not knowing what she was getting into, and I don't know what caused her to find the courage to publish what she did. But she, I mean, again, I won't say too much more, but in that there's one anecdote Maurice Strong develops about how when he was still the president of Power Corporation, which sort of ran the monopoly for the hydroelectric power of Quebec, he was like the youngest CEO after he was brought back from the Rockefeller Foundation, and he became CEO from a variety of things. But he describes how he was brought in quickly to become a top controller and headhunter in the Liberal Party, and had fielded a bunch of potential talent, and was on the selection committee that selected Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Like that's the way they kind of work with like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. You know, they look for people who've got a sort of look and can speak, well, and can be marketed in the form of Trudeau. It was Trudeau mania. They just used the Beatles selling literally they did. Women were like, like throw their panties at him and stuff. It's weird. And he was on the selection committee with Walter Lockhart Gordon, who plays a big role in the Dope Inc. book as one of the key architects of the global drug money laundering schemes through the Caribbeans, Scotiabank, a lot of the Canadian banks that play a big role in global back then as well as today. money laundering. So Walter Lockhart Gordon was the president of the Privy Council of Canada in 1965 or 66. Maurice Strong, he became the head of external affairs, and then he founded the Canadian International Development Agency that sort of rewired how loans to poor countries were going to operate on the condition that they all became enmeshed with IMF or World Bank conditionalities. And so, Strong played a key role in that operation. But yeah, he was on the selection committee with Lockhart Gordon to pick out.
They sort of devised the principles by which the IMF then later used as sort of the model, or they sort of worked hand in hand, or how does that connect?
Hand in hand, yeah. I mean, I don't know. People tended to trust Canada. It's sort of a weird thing that people of the world.
Why is that? Yeah, because like when we that's the perception I get.
We didn't deserve
friends
it.
And family. If anything, they seemed like they were the northern branch of the British Empire that sort of utilized hegemony against us and the.
Well, it was this middle power thing, right? So that was
middle power is a great word description. Yeah,
that was the model that was adopted. I mean, I'm sure Yandell Elliott. A lot of these discussions happen because you're like wondering how could one guy like Yandell Elliott produce such diverse students and prodigies like Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski, and then Trudeau, who's like meeting up with Castro and Mao and also befriending Reagan and stuff. And you're like, what the hell is this weird chameleon type of thing? And Trudeau was asked one time in 1969, what is your, how would you describe your foreign policy? And his answer was simply create counterweights. Not many people understood what he was saying, but he's a puppet, but he was a smart puppet. He understood what the nature of the game was. So anytime the Cold War is all based upon this idea of a mathematical balance as much as possible. It was a Manichaean dualism. Yes. And so if the geographical or the gravitational center shifted too much towards the Soviet side, then you sort of befriend the Americans and the capitalists. And then if same thing happens, that gravity center moves over to the capitalist side a little bit, then Canada throws its weight over to, hugging Castro or visiting Mao or something. And so you always just keep things in as much of a counterweight type of balance as possible as part of a broader great game. But you can't get this by looking at Canada itself. And that's where most Canadian authors and historians have gotten it all wrong, because they, just like American authors, they tend to look at the world through a purely American-centric filter. Canadian authors do the same. British authors, I'm sure, do the same. But it's so important to look at first the global chemistry as a higher whole. And then you can sort of make sense of the context in which the parts operate, right? And people like, Trudeau, he was, for example, a leading Fabian who was controlled by a Rhodes Scholar named F.R. Scott, who was his primary handler. F.R. Scott, along with 5 other Rhodes Scholars, S. Scott Reed being another one, who was I would say the major architect of NATO 2 years before NATO was created. This was S. Scott Reed's baby. But these 5 Rhodes Scholars set up in 1931 the Canadian Fabian Society, the League of Social Reconstruction. And it had a political branch, just like the British Fabian Society earlier had its political branch called the Labour Party.
Labour Party, yeah.
The Canadian branch, the Canadian political party was called the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, set up in 1932 as a way to create a scientific organization of society, right? Manage society under scientific management, and you can have a better equal distribution of wealth, get rid of private property, all this stuff that sounds
kind of euphemized it, even though it's really just a racist sort of like top-down system. And you talk about race patriots, they were utilizing the sort of new sign to the emerging Darwinian evolutionary model and the X Club and Thomas Huxley and all those figures. Yeah.
Well, they're all eugenicists, right?
Exactly.
And so Trudeau is brought back from Harold Lasky's control at the London School of Economics. He's given like this 500-day tour of the world in 1949 to just get a sense of like, it's like his training to see how the international appendages of the empire work before he's sent back to Canada in 1950 to be positioned in the Privy Council office, which is sort of the nerve center of the cybernetics command of Canada. It's the Privy Council or the Privy Council office per se. And so he's there. His handler is F.R. Scott, one of the 6 or 5 Rhodes Scholars. And this thing he becomes a member of that political party, it changes its name in 1960 to what's called the New Democratic Party, the NDP, which is sort of the third big party in Canada even today. But they can't get political power because they're a little bit too Marxist, and people, Canadians aren't feeling that. They're just not, there's a glass ceiling they can't break past. So a decision is made around this time in the late 50s to focus their energy on transplant, kind of the way Venice took over Amsterdam and Britain earlier. They're like, we're going to do that same thing. We're going to take the Liberal Party, which at that time is a very different beast than the Liberal Party of today. It was still a party of progress, the party of C.D. Howe, large-scale, development projects, anti-imperialism. A lot of really good people were in that. Our Avro Aero space program, aerospace, nuclear power, like all of these cutting-edge things were all being driven by that Liberal Party. So that was being purged. They started a process of purging it of all of those nationalists. And the guy who was in charge of doing that, and I've written a lot about that in volume 4 of my Untold History of Canada, is Walter Lockhart Gordon. And he's the kingmaker, and he's doing that, and they're infesting it like a virus would infest a white blood or a good blood cell. And immediately all of these NDP Fabians switch over, like Pierre Trudeau and his entourage, and they become liberals, and they become then all of a sudden, once that party is purged by 1963, they take power. You have a
inside out, from the inside out, so people don't realize. Change
because people don't get that it's wolves in sheep's clothing.
That's
and
exactly
they put it right there in their logo. They're like, here it is.
It's in their own logo.
Insane.
I mean, there's the Fabian Society in London. And a buddy of mine, a Tragedy and Hope subscriber from years ago, Mike Mitchum, I'm pretty sure he got us shots of the Fabian Society. He's the one that shot the Banksy GCHQ installation for us for the Bill Binney interview. Yeah, I've got a lot of good stuff from him over there. And so, it's like, LD, can you bring it up on screen? It's like they're shaping the world to the image. And it's like also wolves and sheep.
Oh,
clothing.
yeah, they're crafting.
Isn't there two parts of it? There's like they're crafting the earth.
As though they're the demiurge itself.
Clothing.
Yeah.
And I was like, why do you think they made this stained glass? If not to be like, hey, this is our way of telling you, fair play. This is what we're doing.
Religion.
Yeah, well, it's revelation of the craft. It's revelation of the craft.
Yeah,
it's sort of they want to
got it. Yeah, it's kind of like they can do it if they tell you, even if you didn't read the small print.
There it is. Yeah, and one guy is Sidney Webb, and the other one is George Bernard Shaw. It was commissioned by George Bernard Shaw. This particular
Sidney Webb and Bernard Shaw.
And
that's
George
the
other
Bernard
one.
They're molding the earth.
George Bernard Shaw was a crazy kind of eugenicist.
He was the one who just wanted to kill them straight up. Yeah.
Racist.
I think that was the dialectic they played. It's like, no, we'll just kill him with kindness. Yeah, we'll just.
That's the guy.
And sheep. That's how I was thinking of Shaw. That's
he literally. There's videos of him on YouTube where he's saying like, we should have a population board where everybody is forced to justify their existence once a year, and if they can't satisfy the reasoning of the population board, then off to the death chambers with them. And he talks in this weird, creepy British accent.
Crazy population council.
Yeah, these are like,
it's like, what about if he had to go in front of that board? Sort of a recursive function there. It's like, would they ever think about that?
Well, they're basically
they don't do self-reflection, self-criticism. They don't.
They're the influence for Orwell's Ingsoc. English socialism in 1984 is just the front for the Fabian Society. Like that's his representation, I think, in that book. So there's a lot to it.
The Endo Elliot. I mean,
starting with Fabius Maximus and the war of attrition strategy that they use.
That, by the way, didn't succeed ultimately because the Romans hated it.
What happened is Trudeau took his sheep's clothing off and he's like, I'm taking your bank accounts because of the trucks. Honk, honk.
Optimus Prime came down.
He's an Aesop's fable walking right now. Warning tale for the future generations.
No, it's it's really, I mean, that's the sad thing, right? Is that I heard you guys were just sort of making fun of the dumbing down the mediocrity of even the messaging and the propaganda outlets where they're forced to bring these like bubblehead kids from TikTok into the White House.
More and more into machines. That's what you said earlier.
Yeah, like I mean, you look at just the quality of mental degeneration between a Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the original, and his son, who's sort of trying to fill his shoes, living in his dad's shadow. And I mean, the kid himself, there's nothing there. He's like a young version of Biden.
Yes, that's right. It's almost as there's no soul, taking that in a very like loose use of the term, but there's like nothing there. There's no sort of inner sort of like introspection, like reflection of their own consciousness or their own motivation. Like there's this self-reflection.
Do you ever wonder if maybe they put out the Sophia robot when they already had Zuckerberg and Elon Musk and these cats out there like that, Justin Trudeau among them, they seem kind of like the tether connection's not high speed, T1 line quality. They're a little slow.
They're a little slow, yeah.
Robotic in their reactions to us.
But see, and so why do people fall for this and think like, oh, what a great guy this Trudeau is? Like he does have a lot, or maybe I don't know if he still does, but he had a lot of support. A lot of people think about, they listen to Mark Zuckerberg or they listen to Elon Musk and they're like, yeah, greatest geniuses of the world. And you're like, why can't you see that there's nothing there? Like, it's pretty clear. These are programmed,
I think we're more as like sociopaths. Like the ability for self-reflection, at least from an empathetic standpoint, and it does almost, some argument can be made that it doesn't even biologically exist as part of those certain parts of the brain. But even if we go away from that, there's just something missing in the concept of like substance or self-reflection. Like they don't have any sort of nuance. The fact that there's such a caricature of themselves even, and the way they present themselves, it's just so strange. Like I think about this with so many of our own, like Nancy Pelosi is one that comes to mind in our government. Like, and Biden obviously he's completely senile, or he's putting on the greatest act of all time. Some people posed that to me in our recent town halls, and like, is he really senile? And it's like, well, I mean, if not, he had his brain cracked open a couple of times, and maybe they tried some of those implants. Who knows? But at this point, it's just it's very strange. The fact that people are willing to fall for it is that. I've gone back thinking, like, is it an evolutionary thing? If that's even a real thing, that's a whole issue in and of itself. I won't get into. But if we say, insofar as like we have some sort of prime animal sort of instinctual behaviors, let's say, like we follow the leader, we want to have a natural tribal leader, being ostracized from a group. What is it that we're like willing to go along with these people that just are so devoid of basic consciousness and basic intelligence?
And most people never change off the defaults. Tom.
Defaults, yeah, it's like a default setting.
And they also default believe Nancy Pelosi has something to do, and they have a connection to her because they voted for her. But really, those people in those buildings, they got there because of special interests and the donors. And those are the calls, and those are the squeaky wheels they take care of, not the citizens not the cattle on the farm, on the ranch, right? So.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of this, and I mean, if this were an evolutionary, like a natural consequence of just the forces of nature, then I think we've got a philosophical crisis, possibly a theological crisis.
I agree. I consider it a philosophical. Yeah, I agree.
A philosophical corruption of reality.
Yeah. That's the whole, like, then God created a big joke that is self-destructive by its own nature. And that's that takes you into a bit of a black hole.
It's a big metaphysical issue.
Nihilistical, just like, let me just get some like cocaine right now.
Yeah, right.
I
agree.
The other thing is the free will approach. And because, how do you know that, would a loving parent allow a kid, would a loving parent not love a kid so much that they would prevent them from making mistakes, is what a naive person might think. And because you just care about the kids so much, you would just put them in a little box so that they'd never fall down. They never try anything new, because that would cause them to screw up, and so you love them too much. Would that actually be a loving parent? No, that's a tyrant. Exactly so right. Like if human beings, if there
Plato
is
defined that way too. I'm glad you said it that way. Yeah. He defined a tyrant in that capacity, at least in many different ways. So that's one of them. That's a brilliant statement, because it's still a form of control. You still want to control the ability for them to actually experience their own world and engage in their own agency as an individual.
But it has nothing to do with the government trying to control you. There's no connection between those two.
Well, but that's the thing, right? Like good government, good statecraft allows for free will. It obviously, like, you need to have laws in a sense. We got it, there's certain structure, but at the same time, do you want that to be like an oligarchical, tyrannical, fascist state that just forces everybody into automaton status so that they're all well behaved? No, you want to allow for the freedom of people to try new things, to make mistakes. And, there's a sort of balance of free will and duty that you have to sort of zero in on. We'll never maybe hit the formula perfectly, because if we did, then we'd become the robots or whatever. Like,
and there's a paradox, another one of these metaphysical paradoxes.
Yeah, exactly.
Manifest themselves. Yeah.
But that's why I love the concepts. When you read the writings of a lot of the founding fathers, there's a certain Platonic sensitivity to this idea of a constant self-perfectibility embedded in the universe.
Yes.
We made the image of that perfectibility.
We
and
participate in it. Yes.
Well, that's why they're called the perfectibilists.
Well, that's across the pond.
I thought it was like, man, I thought you were like lobbing it to me for me to hit it like that. I didn't even...
That's brilliantly well said, though. They did have a sort of Platonic. We stand in participation of a higher order that transcends itself, and there's a beauty, a goodness, and a truth that tries to emanate out of that. But then there's also, you manifest that paradoxically in a world of dualism through the separation of powers because of our own natural proclivity to sort of absolute power corrupts, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. So how do we manage that innate, that mind-body dualism that Plato alludes to?
Plato says you have to come to know yourself, right? Like,
yes,
Plato's
that's
like,
the point.
Yeah, like don't skip steps. Don't try to like become a ruler. Like when he's talking to Alcibiades, he's like, don't just go and just try to run society and determine when you want to make war or peace without first having taken the time to know how your mind and heart work. Exactly. Do that first and then do the other things. And we screw things up every time we skip steps.
Every time we skip, and people sort of confuse the issue of the Plato's Republic as thinking it's, Popper did this terribly, wrote a whole book in this, not understanding one aspect of. Yeah, Soros's teacher. It's interesting. They got the whole thing wrong because in book 2, I think he says this is nothing more than an analogy for the human soul. And so when you go up the, sort of the different caste levels of the Republic, it's actually talking about us as individuals being able to separate ourselves from the foundations of power in many ways. So in book 9, it says this would be an impossible task. This is not something that would manifest in reality. It has something to do with about our own spiritual nature, which is an interesting function. People forget about that. But everything what he did was cryptic, done by analogy, done by allegory. And I think it's because he probably was privy to the mysteries back then, and it was punishable by death potentially to reveal any sort of aspect of the mysteries, which is why he had to set up a school and use analogy and myth and metaphor and allegory in order to try to describe these ideas, and why he's been so confused, even though, as William James said, that all of Western philosophy is a series of footnotes back to Plato, could not be more well said.
Well, if you look at his letter 8 and his letters, which are consciously also out of sync, like they're out of chronological order, but his letter 8 is really good because it's the only one where he talks with, I think it's Dion, I'm not too sure, or no, I forget who he's talking to, but he's writing how he'll never make literal his intention.
Yes.
And it's a strategic design, and he's describing also his personal role geopolitically within a broader process that was underway in the world that he lived in, because people
his mentor was killed, right?
Ivory Tower philosophers. Was that?
Wasn't his mentor killed?
That was a big one. That was a big life changer for him.
Yeah, you will never forget what the democracy produced in that capacity, and also is railing against the oligarchy, which is an interesting facet, as well as I think Aristotle to a degree, which is his most famed student. So there's this elements of like the milieu that existed in ancient Greece that we can sort of transpose onto certain aspects, especially of European and modern history and the Americas, that we sort of stand in participation with and understanding like what was going on back then and how we can draw parallels to today. A lot of people draw from the Roman Empire, but I like to go back to ancient Greece, one, because I'm prejudiced to ancient Greece because I love ancient Greek philosophy, particularly Plato and Aristotle, Plato mainly. But there's a lot that could be learned. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, definitely. I don't know about the Roman Empire, but definitely it's useful to look at how, because it's undeniable that a lot of the founding fathers were influenced by their studies of the Roman Republic, but before it became an empire and degenerated, and the figure of Cicero is kind of like the Socrates of the Roman Republic, right? And he described himself when people were trying to ask him, like, are you a Stoic? He's like, no, I'm not a Stoic. Are you an Epicurean? I'm not that. Of course not. He's like, I'm a Platonist. And he's always trying to intervene to bring people into a higher synthesis outside of this dualism of Epicureanism versus Stoicism, which is what they all thought they had to jump into as one of the extremes. And he was like, no, use your creative reason. And he was always intervening, stopping conspiracies like the Catalan conspiracy, and trying to bring it back. He could see that Rome was degenerating, kind of like Socrates could see Athens was degenerating under Pericles to become an empire where it had backstabbed its allies and was becoming a more bloated parasite. And he's like, no, we have to stop this. We have to push back against the sophists and expose them, those who try to make the lies appear truthful and get
like Iago. Like Iago, you mentioned.
Like Iago, we have to expose the Iagos. And the same fate befell in many ways Cicero, who was, his death marked kind of like Socrates' death, the shifting morally into empire of Rome, where it very swiftly became
republic to empire. That's a perfect analogy. Yeah, that's a great sort of analogy. I mean, because that is exactly what happened. The Periclean age we call the golden age of sort of Athens or ancient Greece, but ironically, it had sort of this like weird dualism between Pericles himself, who stood sort of like as an emperor, and then the Senate, who were constantly embattled, and it ended up in the Peloponnesian War with Athens essentially being destroyed and subjugated towards the end. And also a massive, interestingly enough, there was an outbreak of a disease that took place based on Pericles' strategy. So
build a wall,
build a wall and put all the people together and see if we can handle that. Which sort of strange to me is like the Platonists never saw the dualism as being the metaphysical primary. They always saw it as contraries that had a sort of resolution. And if we could understand that, we can find balance and harmony between each ourselves. And instead, what I've noticed in the modern day is people have taken people like Hegel, and instead of understanding that process, we stand in participation with that. They reverse the process and say it's something we need to manifest later on. It's not something that already has manifested itself and we can work out our differences. No, the differences are primary and through essential.
Because we can manufacture history.
We can manufacture instead of understanding that there is an emanation from a transcendent source. They put the source at the end, and we now have a duty to get to that end. And so you sacrifice the individual for this collective, and that's not what the Platonic idea is at all meant. It's a weird twist that happened that I think was born out of the scientism of the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, the emerging scientism, reflecting upon ancient ideas. And so it's something I've been trying to trace because a lot of philosophers have been. That's
the way you're saying that is so useful. I hadn't thought about it, but it's true. And if you think about like what is it about the perversion, like the neocons? I mean, people I think generally know that the neocons have a certain Straussian heart at their origins, which interprets these are self-professed Platonists.
Yeah, right. That's
are
my
they
problem.
Really?
Right. That's my thing is they got Platonism all wrong. That's the thing. Like if you read Thomas Taylor or you read, the Ficino, for those that can actually understand, this is not the original intention of the ideas. And that's why for me, I've been looking at translations of like how, the various translations and the various sources that are available, it's pretty, they're done within a secular scientific sort of scientism framework, where they secularize it and make it seem like it's more black and white than it actually is. These things are analogy, allegory, myth. They're artistic ways of describing phenomena of general principles that must exist, but those general principles aren't particulars. But then on top of that, you have this weird humanistic sort of vision, to your point about Amsterdam, Venetian taking over Amsterdam, like where they twist the ideas of this new emerging sort of like humanism and this new emerging sort of idea of scientific invention. And they combine it with this like very perverted view of ancient ideas. And you get this sort of like, it's almost like the creation of the alien in Ridley Scott's universe, right? It's into the simulacrum that is essentially the worst manifestation of both ideas put together. Because instead, like it's as if scientific theory took the worst and most misinterpreted elements of Platonism and combined them together and said, well, now we have a scientific duty to create the sort of like misunderstood idea of an idealistic state or idealistic transcendent, whatever that would be. And that's codified in Hegel most specifically. But that's not at all the original intentions. And I've been piecing this together and trying to build out not only an argument, but sort of an essay around the complete differences. And there are many differences between even though you can use Hegel, you can look at Hegel and you can look at the fact that yes, there are all these sort of cults that existed in Europe. We talked about Rosicrucianism earlier. We talked about, we didn't even go into alchemy, but alchemy, and there's so many different alchemical symbols or systems. It's sort of like the European misinterpreted recapitulation of ancient ideas in the light of a new ability of agency to take command of the world in the form of technology and scientific invention that's completely sort of separated from any sort of true transcendent sort of spiritual connection and or the material world itself. And that gets, ironically, I know that seems weird, but there is like a weird twist there as to the way, because the empiricists and rationalists both were skeptical. They both didn't believe that we could actually come to know truth. So they were skeptical. The empiricists were skeptical because we have a sense perceptual apparatus that sees and filters data. And the rationalists are skeptical because we have consciousness and we can deduce from a priori conditions. So they both ended up in nihilism. Both schools ended up in nihilism somehow. Yes. And like that to me is some weird perversion and I've been trying to track it. Like, it's been one of these weird things where it's like, I took Jung's idea where he thinks that like there's this weird admixture that happened in the sort of the emerging scientism of the like 15th, 16th, 17th century, the early modern period, it's often called, mixing with these ancient ideas and sort of justifying that we have a material control, as sort of Karl Rove dictating that we now control history, we create history, and the Hegelian sense that like we can take there really is nothing but a dualism to these people.
Yeah,
we can't really know reality, we can't know truth, and there's just these two dualistic elements that are constantly competing against one another. And so we're just going to weaponize those concepts, and we're going to use it as a way to manifest the future that we idealize as being whatever. But that's the ultimate issue of the Ring of the Myth of Gyges. It's like, you give someone ultimate power, what would they do? And then I think that's Thrasymachus who put it up to play, or Socrates. Yeah.
Well,
I thought of manufacturing history from Hegel to Karl Rove like 5 minutes ago. And so it's funny you brought up Karl Rove, Tony, because I talked about him. I read that quote. We're an empire now, and when we make, you study what we do judiciously as you will, and then we go out and make new realities. I read that to the students earlier today in Q&A because somebody asked about that. So you weren't there, Tony. That's legit synchronicity, which is Jungian. The nature approves of our endeavor. No, seriously though, I was turning around looking for this Rosicrucian book because on the inside is the Great Seal of the United States. And so when I picked up the book of the yard sale, I was like, oh, this looks like the thing on the back of the dollar. And, there are all these elements built into our society, and we're not taught about any of them. So for someone like yourself to undertake the learning and stepping up to opportunities, like if LaRouche had a group there, you didn't have to go and participate and do research and actually get learned, but you did.
Yeah, it's a choice, right? We all make choices.
Yeah, more people can do things like what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it really is just a matter of, I think, taking your destiny in your own hands. Like in a healthy society, I can imagine that we would all have access to proper educational experiences that would give us an ability to appreciate how our minds move when they're being fruitful and making discoveries. That's great. And I hope to God, and I have faith that in the future, that will be what young people have access to. And we don't have that now. We were robbed of that. It's not our fault. We're born into a shitty situation. But so it doesn't mean we're screwed. No, it means that all these great discoveries did happen. It's just that they've been obscured and kept from us. So we have to do a little bit more work and pull up our sleeves to hunt things down like you guys do, and read the original writings and just take our education into our own hands. You guys have created a platform here, which is wonderful, where people can just come and really develop what they should have had access to this whole time. And I think, Tony, touching on what you were saying in terms of the resolution of this thing, that Karl Rove refuses to, and all of the neocons just refuse. I think it has to do with this question of the subjective and objective, because these guys are kind of like voyeurs. They see themselves as shaping a system that is other than them. They're from like a higher elitist class, right?
Yeah, so well said.
And they got these things that they're convinced that all of us are most of human beings are weak, and thus are destined to be enslaved by the master elites, which they must be, because they're the ones who are enslaving us. So they must be genetically superior or something. So it's this dualism that they've got, and they don't see themselves as part of the system that they're trying to deal with. Neither did Karl Popper in a serious way, even though he acts like he did. He did not. With his theory of reflexivity and all that.
Yeah, that's the issue, the recursiveness, and we get Gödel's theorems and stuff like that. The idea of being able to stand outside the system, but you cannot stand outside the system. You cannot stand outside the idea of a universe. You can't stand outside the language we use to describe the experience of existence itself. Yet they deify concepts like cause and effect, or genetics, or science itself, the methodology, as being something that stands outside the system that they can use as a justification for the hegemony they're perpetuating on the people of the world.
Yeah, they got their ivory tower utopia of what they think the system should be that has no bearing in the thing that they're trying to manipulate. So they're imposing onto the thing artificially. Whereas I think that when you actually look at somebody like a Kepler again, or even a Leibniz, like read Leibniz's discourses on metaphysics or something, and you could see that it's all about them or Plato, obviously. We're talking about Plato. It's all about training the mind to think about thinking and think about what is the mind doing, which is interesting because now you haven't. You're trying to solve a problem which appears to be outside of you, but it's all occurring in the mind. And so you go from a state of unknown to known. You make that discontinuous leap into like a eureka, and now you have a new reference point of the subjective inside of you and the objective outside of you. It's a discovery of something outside of you that it just happened, and no longer is there that wall between you and the universe. You like just accessed an eternal.
Yes, you accessed the form, the way Kepler was able to showcase the forms and their geometric proportions in relation to Plato's Timaeus, or in the idea of like ancient.
You're not supposed to know about this. Shut him up. You got a lot invested in this.
Yeah,
right. knowledge of self is only purveyed through secret societies, Matthew. You can't be doing that. That's the Rosicrucian and Freemasons are supposed to keep those secrets and hold that power.
You just do some opium and go into a trance and then come to revelation or something. Yeah,
you're not supposed to be writing your own script in life. You're supposed to be using the Queen's script with all her pictures on it to do all the stuff, how
exactly.
It's an interesting
a good sim character.
juxtaposition you mentioned earlier about sort of the issues, Sarpi, we were talking about the Venetians and the sort of dualism, or this dual idea between, do we suppress the information, because in history that was the issue. Do we complete, especially with the fall of the Roman Empire and it's moving over to East and Byzantium and Constantinople, the suppression of information was so egregious. I mean, as China was going through the beginnings of like their golden age, essentially, of civilization, we're going into a dark age. And we look at like the progression of what happened as far as the suppression of knowledge and the suppression of even being able to allow to speak. For example, Paris banned Aristotle in like 1231. They banned his physics and his metaphysics. It was something like canceled. That. And he got canceled. Yeah. There's heresies against the new emerging, what was being brought back from the sacking of Constantinople and the Crusades and obviously we had the Reformation that took place, and then the Counter Reformation, and we have all these situations, and then but that was the strategy, to your point. That was the strategy for hundreds of years: suppress, or only give a very few people, maybe sort of ascetic monks, or people part of Charlemagne's court, the access to information in order to justify the faith in some capacity, the war against like Tertullian or Anselm. But then there is this, they allow it it gets out. It just starts to get out. You can't stop it. Then you have invention, the printing press, Gutenberg, 15th century. You have the Venetian, you have the Ficino translating all these different things, you have different cults sort of popping up around these ideas. You can't stop it anymore, because then you'd have to tackle all of Europe at this point. It's almost becoming too ubiquitous. So it's like, how do you spin it, in other words? And I wonder, is there a way to draw parallels to what we're experiencing today? Because on one level, I'm seeing individuals, young children, being completely sort of like, I sort of alluded to earlier, they're not able to think. They're not being taught their processes by how to think, or how their own natural mind works, body, soul, mind complex works. But at the same time, there's also this sort of like, I think about it, is there's so much information being foisted upon us that we tend to just not even give into the information, I guess, or explore it. Instead, go for that called the dopamine drips, the quick hits on YouTube. So it almost seems to be like a juxtaposition between the two still existing in modern times. Maybe I'm just like taking this way too far, but maybe I'm trying to find an analogy where
you're going way too far, dude. You can't talk about that stuff on this podcast. By the way,
it seems like both
are Osiris, thousands of years old, supposedly. That's what these people tell their people in the club. But that's the thing on the dollar that I was talking about. I did find the book. It was just hiding behind.
Yeah. That was brought in like 1932, right?
Henry Wallace. I think it was Wallace that brought it in under FDR. But that's a garage sale book. Look at that.
That was a garage sale book. That's a good find.
Rosicrucian, garage sale. You got to learn.
Let's not forget about what they did to Manly Palmer Hall. I mean, he was forced to become a 33-degree Freemason, and then they sort of ritualistically murder him. I mean, he was a big guy. He had a lot of health problems. But
I wasn't sure if Hall was a psyop or not. Like, it was never. I've never been clear on where he actually stood.
He's a strange figure. He's a
weird guy. Yeah. I read him like he's probably lying.
He's like a historian
but saying things that are true at the same time.
Well, he's like a historian for the people, like for the the inner sect, if you will. So I look at it like almost like a more dubious form of because Quigley was sort of a historian for the inner sect, so he didn't mean to be. I mean, he didn't.
I don't know. Like I read his Anglo-American establishment book, and it doesn't seem like he really sympathizes with the oligarchy.
When was that published though? Because Rich, when was that?
After he died.
After he died.
1981.
Yeah, 81. Yeah.
This
do we know when he wrote, like when he began writing about? Because my curious question is like, we know.
Yeah, he wrote it in 1948.
It was 1948 when he wrote Anglo-American Establishment.
Yeah, because Alfred Zimmern comes to him and is like, here's this crazy story. And he's like, I don't know if I'm going to go risk my career on your crazy story. I'm going to research it for the next 20 years. Then he's like, I got to tell people, but in a way that's coded. So that was Tragedy and Hope. And then after
I see, that's my question. It was coded with tragedy.
But to the Manly Palmer Hall aspect, I read this book by Louis Hagen, and it seems that he was ritually murdered. And the
ending's insane.
Yeah, it's a bad ending, but he's an interesting guy. He's a Canadian, kind of Rosicrucian. He grew up with his grandmother, was his basically who raised him. She encouraged him to raise book. And I came to this book after hearing probably a couple hundred hours of his lectures, because he used to do a weekly 90-minute lecture. And then this woman, She Who Remembers, Jeannie Erstad, had made this whole collection of all these radio broadcasts from all these different people, Dave Emery and Manly Palmer Hall, all these things that were out there. So I just took it as raw material for consideration. And here's this nice older man who's telling us the story of antiquity, and I liked how he talked. So I was like, and then I'd look stuff up for myself, but I didn't look at it like he's a source of the source. He's just the messenger. And in that message, there's things to pick up on and look up and, oh, wow, they really did do this type of thing back then. Or he said this book or whatever, had this thing. So you go look it up, and that's how you kind of weigh it. But the establishment did not like him.
Yeah.
It was of what they did at the end. It was awful.
Yeah.
And I read, there's
he also
a lot
got
of marked pages in this book.
Wow. I remember reading that. You gave me that book and said, especially read the ending of it. And it was, it's pretty. He's a strange figure. He's enigmatic, because I agree, Matt. It's.
But he wrote The Secret Destiny of America.
Yeah,
which ties into Francis Bacon and all that good stuff.
That's another issue. The new scientism.
Well, Francis Bacon. But here's the. I feel like we don't have time to unpack.
I know, but it was like a good first meeting. We made lots of positive. I said, we don't have time to unpack everything, but I think
complexity around Bacon.
We can have you back as a semi-regular guest and have more of these conversations.
Yeah.
And I also have some other bigger, better ideas, but this was good because I was like, let's get them on the show. Let's showcase your work. Let's point people toward the articles, especially that you've written. But I enjoyed your interview with Whitney, on the podcast.
Fantastic.
And then I enjoyed your debate with the other guy who was slightly different version of the theory, and he's trying to go back and forth with you in that debate. And I thought, I
didn't know what I was walking into with that thing, but that was that was interesting.
I could see his side, but I could also see where the incongruencies or the contradictions on his side would mesh with your story. So in the future, I think you guys are probably friends, but he's coming in hot. He's like, no, but this. And I was like, this is what needs to be done. We need to get to the best ideas, the ones that,
absolutely
end up reflecting reality. And,
I feel like on a different platform, if we were just having a beer together, we'd hit it off just great, but I didn't expect that level of aggression coming into it, and I didn't even know what it was about, so it kind of unsettled me. But I think this is good. And I just, before I forget, one thing that you guys have to read, it's short, it's not a book I'm going to throw at you, but it's short. It's Edgar Allan Poe's Eureka, his thoughts on the material and spiritual universe. It's a prose poem, but it's prose. He wrote it a few months before he was killed in 1848. And it was the basis upon which it was the manifesto, as he described it, for the New Stylist magazine that he was going to create a few weeks after he died, because he was on the route back from Baltimore to New York, where he had raised money, a lot of money, from supporters who wanted to help him build this, because he was always an editor for other people's magazines. And with the Stylus, which he had the cover design, he drew it himself. He wrote out the manifesto that it was going to be about political analysis, historical analysis, poetry, prose, and cultural warfare.
Interesting.
It's just like JFK Jr.'s George magazine. It has nothing to do with.
No, total coincidence. Sure. Yeah. And this thing too, when you read this, you're going to be struck by the fact that he is attacking two modes of thinking for the first 20 pages: the creeping and the crawling mode of a posteriori and a priori methods of Euclid and the hog Bacon. Which mankind has been given falsely as two methods of coming to truth, and where one just creeps, the other crawls, but we are a species that is designed to soar. That's why it's called Eureka.
That. That's fantastic. I'm absolutely.
He even cites Kepler. He has a paragraph where he's translated Kepler's harmonies in it. it's intense, and then you start getting a sense
of
why this guy was so
motions is very Kepler's laws of motion. I mean, we sort of deified Newton around it, and but there's a reason why I think we sort of. It's the same reason we look at Einstein today. Like, it's a certain celebrity around the way in which we artificially build up the historicities or the hagiographies, if you will, of these individuals, instead of recognizing the contributions that came before them that actually had, if you look into their work, there's something more that can be said. Oh, did I got muted.
Me too.
Are we good?
Sorry,
okay.
I don't know how that happened.
Good. You're good. But there's, my point is, I guess, Webster Tarpley sort of alluded to this a little bit. It's the reason why I think we sort of focus on certain celebrity positions in history, the way we sort of like normalized history, if you will. And Newton being sort of, I get like he sort of codified the laws of motions in a certain, especially with the new calculus emerging, but it was born upon Kepler's laws of motion that are very interesting. But then Kepler had this, to your point, this sort of more interesting way of looking at the mind and looking at the nature of discovery. Because the issue of a priori and a posteriori, that'll never, like, the meeting point between the two is that truth is unknowable, because how do you jump from the inductive to the deductive? I get this question all the time when I teach logic, and it's like that issue there is where free will exists. And so what they say is that because of that free will, the truth is unknowable in some capacity, because we're always sort of fallible. Of course, that presupposes truth is knowable. If you say it's unknowable, that's
or not to think, that is the question. And
it's an artificial dichotomy.
You start thinking.
Yeah, it's an artificial dichotomy.
Good point. Yeah, this is fun. I didn't expect the conversation to go in this direction, but these directions, and this is great. I had a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was a good
incredible mind, incredible work. I just want to get this on the.
Do your thing before I get his sites again at the end.
Yeah, I was gonna put his sites on. So here's the Rising Tide Foundation. I have a bunch of tabs open because I want to read a bunch of atomic physics and Luc Montagnier and the book review, The Nature of the Atom. That looks very interesting. And Entropy.
Oh, that's a mind-blowing book. The Nature of the Atom, the structured atomic model. Whew.
I got to check this out.
Oh, man,
I'm going to be
really great.
Like your website is sort of like become my main go-to now for intellectual endeavors. Awesome. We share a lot in common in regards to the way you view history and society and philosophy too. I like the fact that you don't take such a, in conspiracy communities, a lot of people take a very black and white position. Like they say, oh, well, Strauss is connected with Plato and Popper sort of gives his analysis of the Republic or something, therefore Plato bad. And they just have this sort of initial sort of bias to it and this hasty generalization. And I'm like, you don't have that. Your website's filled with a lot of nuance. This is one. And the other one is this website here, the Canadian Patriot. If I'm not yep. That you can buy the books, and just awesome work. I'm so glad that I got the chance to see your presentation, because I had no idea who you were, as Rich alluded to before, the Reiner Fulmick grand jury. So,
and we're glad to surprise you that you didn't know us either, but we got good things coming your way as well. So,
well, yeah, no, you guys have been on my radar for a while. I haven't really fully immersed myself, but I'm very, very impressed. This is a good thing that you guys are doing.
Well, right on. I appreciate likewise. You like
and your stamina is astounding. The fact that you guys on a regular basis put out 7-8 hour productions.
This is the easiest part of my weekend. I lecture for 7 hours on Friday night. I did 5 hours with the students today because I did an after show today, and now we're doing this. And then most of the week I'm off. I deal with clients. It's like I get a couple rest days, but this isn't my rest day. This is my work.
When you say you lecture students, what do you lecture?
Oh, I teach a course called Autonomy that basically puts back into our education that which they took out to make it schooling. So you put back in free will, critical thinking, creative problem solving, active literacy and rhetoric skills, and then high value skills of entrepreneurism or executive management if you want to work in a company. Either way, I teach like 100 students a season or a couple hundred a year. Twice a year I teach. So we just started this Friday was the first lecture. So I'm still getting my my stride back for doing all these productions.
Getting the stamina back up. I mean, same thing. I mean, I took 2 days off because I had a course I teach the GTW community logic in the Aristotelian and Platonic framework. And I did like 5 or 6 hours and I was asleep for the next 2 days. And then, but Rich, I don't know, he does it
Friday, all night. Fascinating. I'm really happy. What you said, what's this community that you're teaching?
Okay, so Tony's course is
for
like
autonomy as well.
It's for members of the Grand Theft World, right? Because you're
members
teaching...
of the Grand Theft World and autonomy communities. So it's Richard's community. It's both, but I made it available because to make explicit the way in which they're lying to us and creating cognitive dissonance. I at least want to give people the basics of how, in his Aristotle's like sophistical refutations against the sophists, how he outlined and defined, these rhetorical techniques. And to your point earlier, one of the issues that the sophists did is they would essentially write out the arguments for individual, but they wouldn't show you how you arrived at argumentation itself. And that was his big critique, is like, how do you even arrive at the nature of truth or the nature of being and all these sorts of ideas? So he wanted to give the tools for people to do that themselves. And that's what I'm trying to get back
wasn't
to.
Wasn't it Corax of Syracuse or Corax of Sicily that brought sophism to Greece in the first place?
Correct. Yeah, Corax. Yep, that is absolutely correct.
Long train of abuses we have suffered. We got to learn our way out. Joshua, if you can hear me, will you send like the Freedom Vault and the Library of Cognitive Liberty to Matthew sometime this week? Just like a mental.
I was already sending him email.
Thank you, sir.
Awesome. Cool. And I'll send you guys, send me your mailing addresses too. I'll send you a couple of signed copies of the Clash of the Two Americas. And that should, I don't know, probably
I will read and highlight them.
Fantastic. Yeah.
You will. When a lot of people tell me that, I'm like, yeah, sure. But I've seen your books and I believe that you actually will.
When I first met him 10 years ago, I went through his library. He has esoteric section of his library and his exoteric, and nearly every book had Marx in it. And he labels, like, if you Rich, you can show
he's
like
highlighted. He's a communist. You mean he's not a communist though, right?
No, different Marx. That's why I was being clear. Good. He's got a sense of humor too. That's good.
That's funny. But the whole thing was marked up. Yeah, wink, wink. So he had the little red tape, and he had it perfectly lined up, going in a sort of linear fashion from top to bottom. And then he had everything marked. And I'm like, wow, he really did actually read all this stuff. I mean, a lot of it's reference
to read it and not be able to remember it for recall. So I try to like give myself handles to do that. Either put it in my history blueprint or put some notes in the book, so it all comes back together.
Yeah, it has to be punctuated with some meaning in the mind. No, it's good. You guys are rare breeds. That's good. You got to make this.
Well, you yourself as well. I mean, your work is absolutely incredible. I mean, I had no idea about the Canadian connection or what happened with why it's always been a part, essentially, of the Commonwealth model and never sort of gained a sense of independence. As my dad likes to call it, like a sort of a franchisee of the crown. I was like, it's why
it's not untrue. And you appreciate, I think, as an American, I've encountered a lot of American feedback when they've read my Untold History of Canada books. You kind of appreciate being an American or the American experience a little bit more when you look at the Canadian angle for like, in what the hell happened here in this weird monarchy of the North. And it's like, and it's a constitutionally organized deep state structure from the get-go, from 1774 in the Quebec Act all the way to the present.
Hudson Bay Company.
We're
East India Company down here. You're Hudson Bay Company up there.
Yeah.
The connection with, especially what happened with, there's an article you have about the greenbacks and the Lincoln, and then this is what happened around the Civil War too. That was an interesting. I was not quite as aware. I mean, I know Canada wasn't directly involved, but at least with the perpetrators or supposed perpetrators, there was a sort of connection between institutions and filter. I mean, it's just these are aspects I was not aware of.
Oh man, no, it is so fascinating, that Civil War period, because you have the Confederacy intelligence operations that are all over Montreal, Toronto, and Halifax.
I would never have thought that.
No, and a key guy in this whole thing is George Saunders, a Confederate, I think he's a colonel, but he's like one of the key intelligence operators up here. Huh?
Not Sanders.
Colonel Sanders.
I don't know if there's a direct connection. He actually looks a little bit like the guy, like the chicken guy. But he was actually renowned for being, because he was part of the Franklin Pierce government, which was like a young Mazzini-controlled Freemasonic government in the United States in the 1850s. And he was up there in Europe, in Italy, partying with Mazzini, who had the whole Albert Pike connection. So, you got these different anarchists running the young Europe movement, out of which Engels and Marx are created to sort of, create a sabotage operation from the spread of the Frederick List American system political economy that was being adopted all over countries like Russia, Europe, everywhere, modeled on what Lincoln was doing with the greenbacks. And the whole protective tariff, long-term credit emissions, national banking, all of that, that's what was being disrupted by the Mazzini networks that were just weaponizing people and mobs. So
the 19th century British model that, like, when we talk about color revolutions, when we talk about what's going on, what happened with Ukraine, when we talk about what happened in Serbia or Egypt, I'm like, this is a model that goes back like well over 100 years to the British State Department and Palmerston. And I mean, it just, incredible work, and providing those connections really helped sort of round out our perspective, because we certainly have an American-centric viewpoint, not because we just, it's too much information. We need other people to provide their unique specialization. You've done incredible work, so kudos. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. Like there's a lot of topics for people to dig into who are listening, and I always encourage them, if we said something that you don't understand, start looking it up. That's where the learning starts. And I got some ideas what we could talk about next time. So I think this is a good first workout, and a lot of value can be had from studying what we just unfolded in the past 2 hours. And that was spontaneous. Like I haven't even emailed with Matthew. It was all kind of like done through Stephanie and Twitter and LD, and so it's a pleasure to make your acquaintance. I think there's a lot more we can learn from each other, and I look forward to defending freedom and liberty for future as well as the present.
Wise words to end on. That's good.
Right on. We're going to list your links in the show notes so people can click through, get your books, check out your articles, check out your site, keep up with you. And thank you again for making time in your busy schedule. Have a good night.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I look forward to the next chat.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too. Thank you very much. Peace. Really great to meet you.
Yeah, likewise.